Greetings from the National Law School. I am Professor Sarsu Esther Thomas, and I'll be taking you through a very essential module in human rights law, that is rights of persons with disabilities. Let us now look at this very essential module, that is rights of persons with disabilities. Let's quickly take a look at the contents. So the main modules that we'll be discussing are displayed on the slide. I'll quickly take you in a couple of minutes through the history and traditions of the treatment of persons with disability. Then we look at the different definitions of disability and approaches to looking at rights of persons with disability. And then we'll be looking at two different sets of standards. One is the set of standard at the international level, that is the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then we'll be looking at our own country, India, and examining the standards that exist to protect this group of individuals in India. We'll be examining disabilities in two ways. One is that we will be looking at physical disability, and while discussing physical disability, we look really at the provisions of the laws in India, which talks about specific things that the state is required to do. And we look at the right to access and reasonable accommodations and focus on the removal of barriers. Now, the next area that we are dealing with is mental disability. Here, while we are looking at the laws on disability standards, we are also going to be looking at a few other laws, not too many. We'll be looking at criminal laws, a little bit of civil laws, a little bit of family law, to see how mental disability is currently treated in the law. This is needed because insanity, unsoundness of mind, etc. are important standards which have to be separately discussed. After that, we will towards the end look in detail at our constitution, the few provisions which exist on disability, and the way that courts have really tried to understand inclusiveness and how persons with disabilities' rights should be guaranteed in different ways. Finally, it is impossible to understand difficulties of all different categories of persons with disability. So we'll be looking at two categories specifically. We'll be examining disability and gender, and we'll also be examining disability with regard to children, because problems of women with disability would be very different from men with disability, and problems of children with disability may be different from that of adults with disability. The first unit, we'll be looking at history and traditions. Now, traditions are very important with regard to persons with disabilities for many reasons. In Indian society particularly, we see that there are many superstitions that people have or may have regarding persons with disabilities. There is often a superstition that you may have done, something bad in your previous life, which is why you were born as a person with disability. And this often leads to the blaming of persons with disability for something that they have no control over and shaming them. They are often labeled unfit and worthless, and they are not seen as human beings who have the same rights as anyone else or are entitled to the same kind of social recognition and the same dignity as anybody else. We also see a large number of stereotypes of persons with disability. In some of the movies, we see that a villain may have a prominent disability, like, for instance, a pirate may be shown as having only one eye, or a person may be shown with a limp, or some other kind of disability. And this is really very harmful to trying to understand persons with disability as those of equal worth. Of course, historically, we've seen over the world that there have been, very harmful traditions as well. For instance, during Hitler's time, we know that there were pogroms carried out against persons with disability. Many of them were sent to concentration camps or killed because they were seen as aberrations of nature and not fit to live as other people were. Now, while there is a lot to do to dispel these traditions, we must remember that these traditions did not simply work as social practices. They were also sometimes reflected in legal standards. And in these legal standards, we see that human rights of persons with disabilities were actually affected. For instance, many of them were not treated as legal persons, or rather they had legal incapacity. Later we will see, when we examine contract law, for instance, that a person with disability cannot, mental disability sometimes cannot enter into a valid contract. So they were seen as unfit people to hold property, to carry on, contracts by themselves. They could not even sign a rental agreement to rent a house by themselves if they had mental disability. We also see that they were denied autonomy. So someone was seen as having charge of these people with disabilities. So people with disabilities would either be under the care of their father or mother or brothers or sisters or other family members who decided what was best for them. Now, what was best for them may not necessarily have been what was best for them or what they wanted. So their autonomy to deal with their own lives as they thought fit was often denied. We also see that very often rights were completely denied to them. Until the British came to India and changed some laws, for instance, many times persons with disabilities such as physical disability, blindness, deafness, etc. were not even allowed to inherit property because of their disability. So we see that being a person with disability often led to the violation of human rights. And this is something that went on for a very long period of time. And slowly, with the coming into force of international standards and domestic laws, we see that slowly, to some extent, the human rights of persons with disabilities have been coming to the forefront. Now, when we talk about disability, there are different ways of looking at disability. Now, when we look at recent times, we see that the rights-based approach is fairly new. Earlier, much earlier, there was possibly a denial of rights, or later there's a charity model that you give something to persons with disability. If it's a poor beggar, you give some money, or if you give something to somebody who has a disability, it's good for you. So it was not seen as a right that a person with disability had. If somebody helped, it was good of them, but it was not a right that a person with disability had. So typically speaking, a charity model would mean that if a person could not walk, someone would carry them up the steps as a charitable gesture. They would not think of the person who's not able to walk having a right to access those stairs through an elevator or through some other means, through having the barriers to his movement challenged and removed to make different environments accessible. Now, there are two main models which are often used to study disability. One is a medical model. The medical model looks at disability, of course, as a medical disability, and it focuses on the individual who has a disability. So it tries to make a person with disability as much, quote unquote, normal as possible. This is a wrong word to use. And that is what the medical model focused on. So it thought of changing the person to fit the environment. But today's approach is very different. And the current approach, which is better accepted, is what is called the social model. The social model recognizes that discrimination because of disability is not simply because of the person's disability, but because of social attitudes towards disability, the way that society views disability. So a person who does not have a leg or who has locomotor disability, for instance, cannot move around, not just because of his or her disability, but because we make steps which are difficult for many people to walk on. So the social model of disability is something which is evidenced in the UN Convention, which we'll be examining, as well as some of the laws that we have in India today. Now, let us look at the next unit. How do we define disability? When we look at how we look at disability, we see that we move from excluding disabled people from laws to saying that, well, they are people whom the law should not be concerned with or rights should not be concerned with, to then treating them separately, saying that we treat able-bodied persons in one way and people with disabilities in another way, to inclusion and integration, saying that, to give an example, children with disabilities should be in regular schools and not in special schools. To finally looking at a multi-pronged attack, to say that we must not just have inclusion and integration, but where needed, you need to take affirmative action. You need to have special measures to deal with issues that arise from disability. Now, the most important standard that we have on disability law is what is called the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability. Now, let's look at the definition in this important standard. It says that people with disabilities include those with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society or on an equal basis with others. So it's a fairly large definition covering different kinds of disability, including physical, mental, intellectual, sensory, etc. It does not go into the nitty-gritty. It does not say, all right, what should be the approach for a particular kind of disability. So it lays down broad standards, as we will see later, which it expects state parties to rely on. Now let's look at our domestic standards. In India, we have much more focused standards and definitions on disability. So when we look at the Rights of Persons with Disability Act 2016, we see that it uses different kinds of terms. I'm just mentioning 3 terms here. Person with benchmark disability, which means a person with not less than 40% of a specified disability, where the specified disability is not being defined in measurable terms already. And it includes a person with disability where specified disability has been defined in measurable terms. This has to be certified by a recognized authority. If you look at the next definition, it is a person with disability having high support needs, the last one. And that means someone who requires much more support. And in the middle, we see a general definition that is a person with disability. Now, let's compare this with the international definition. So here we see it is very similar to the UN definition. This says the person with disability means a person with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with barriers hinders his full and effective participation in society equally with others. So it's very, very similar to the international definition. But keeping in view the way that the government has approached the issue of disability, we have certain additional definitions as well. So when we look at the UNCRPD, the international standard, we see that the focus of this entire thing is discrimination. Why do we deal with disability separately? It's because persons with disabilities are discriminated against. So when we look at it here, when it looks at discrimination on the basis of disability, it talks about any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of disability, which has a purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. It includes all forms of discrimination, including denial of reasonable accommodation. So on the one hand, it says that every single human right and fundamental freedom that everyone else has, to get an example of all these human rights and fundamental freedoms, just go through all the modules that you've been studying. In all the modules, you've dealt with different kinds of rights. So how do these apply with regard to persons with disability? With regard to persons with disability, they have the same rights in criminal law. So if a person who's disabled is a witness, for instance, they should have, and the person has a speech impairment, or is deaf, or is dumb, cannot speak, they have the right to have someone with them who can translate, who can communicate to the court what this witness has to say. In employment, it means that you cannot discriminate against someone and say that you cannot be employed on the basis of a disability, provided the person has met the other criteria. And in such cases, you have to make sure that there is in every case reasonable accommodation. So in an employment, if a person with disability is unable to perform a particular function because of their disability, reasonable accommodation must be made. Reasonable steps should be taken to facilitate their working by removing the barriers which they face in this work. So you see, it's a really broad definition and it prevents so many different kinds of discrimination on any basis. So the purpose of this definition is to ensure not just nominal equality on the face of things, but actual real equality of persons with disabilities with everybody else. Now, the main features of the Act that we have in India is that disability has been defined in a very dynamic and evolving way. So it, improvements can be made, more people can be brought into this system. And we see that while the earlier Act had about or recognized about 7 different types of disabilities, it has gone up to about 21. And the central government has the right to add more disabilities to this list. Now, these are the disabilities which are recognized: blindness, low vision, leprosy-cured persons, hearing impairment, which includes deaf as well as hard of hearing, locomotor disability, dwarfism, intellectual disability, mental illness, autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, chronic neurological conditions, learning disabilities, multiple sclerosis, speech and language disability, thalassemia, hemophilia, sickle cell disease, multiple disabilities, and it also includes acid attack victims and persons with Parkinson's disease and so on. So some of them are very particular to India, like acid attack victims, who are recognized as a category of persons with disabilities under the law. 3 blood disorders, which are not really considered disability in many jurisdictions, are considered disability here, including thalassemia, hemophilia, and sickle cell disease. So, speech and language disability and specific learning disability have been added for the first time. And so too have the 3 blood disorders, which we've seen in the list. So, for persons with benchmark disabilities and those who have high support needs, there are some additional benefits given. And there are also benefits given with regard to children with disabilities. While children generally have the right to primary education from the age of 6 to 14, the age in cases of children with disabilities has been extended to 18 years, and they have the right to free education until the age of 18. So now let's look at this unit, which deals with the Disability Convention in detail. The Disability Convention has been around for a little more than a decade, and along with its optional protocol, it was adopted in 2006, opened for signature in 2007, and came into force in 2008. Now, this is intended as a human rights instrument, and if you look at the language of the convention, it is clearly in a human rights set in a human rights framework, and we see that it has explicit social development dimension. It adopts a very broad categorization of who persons with disabilities are, and it says that persons with disabilities must enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms. It also qualifies how all categories of rights apply to persons with disabilities and identifies areas where reasonable accommodation has to be made and identifies specific areas which need to be targeted for effective exercise of human rights. Now, very briefly, the purpose of the convention, as we've said time and again, is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disability, and to ensure respect for the inherent dignity of every person with disability. Now, there are some basic principles which are put down in this convention. Let us quickly go through them with examples. Respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices, and independence of persons. So persons with disability are not seen as an appendage of families, but as rights-bearing individuals on their own. Non-discrimination. which we've said earlier, they have every right to all human rights and fundamental freedoms as anyone else. Full and effective participation and inclusion in society. For instance, making it possible for a person with disability to go to a voting booth, to be able to see the choices, or to be able to identify the choices if a person does not have sight, and to cast a vote accordingly, and also to be included in society, to be represented when decisions concerning them are being taken. Respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as a part of human diversity and humanity. So moving from the old medical model or the earlier charity model, where persons with disabilities are seen as burdens on the society, they are seen as full human beings, adding to the diversity of humankind. Equality of opportunity. The jobs, educational opportunities, etc. should not be denied to them on the basis of their disability. Accessibility. Access to physical spaces, being able to go between floors of a building, for instance, being able to move on a road, being able to get into public transport, to be able to read books in a library, and so on. Equality between men and women, something that we will discuss when we look at intersectionality and the portion on gender. Respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, and respect for the rights of children with disabilities to preserve their identities. Again, something which we will examine when we look specifically at the unit on children. We see that there are many articles in the Convention which impose certain duties upon different countries to take measures or steps to protect the rights of persons with disabilities. Now, I've taken a few articles as examples. So Article 4, for instance, talks about the legal framework which has to be made, that you need to have laws, administrative decisions, practices that uphold rights and which prohibit discrimination. And interestingly, Article 8 deals with combating stereotypes. As we saw when we looked at traditions, stereotypes when we come to persons with disabilities is something which deeply affects their rights. They are seen as people who should be taken care of, not persons who are full human beings capable of taking care of themselves, making decisions on their own. So the stereotypes of persons with disabilities as, it being their karma, or being less individuals, or infantilizing them. For instance, we see very often that especially women with disabilities may be dressed in clothes which are suitable for younger girls than people of their own age. We also see that states have to guarantee that the inherent right to life that each of us has as human beings is also available to persons with disabilities. Now, when we talk about the right to life in the Constitution of India, we see that the statements has been made that the right to life is so broad that it can bring in the sky. So everything from maybe access to clean drinking water, access to primary education, access to non-discrimination, to equal employment, to hospitals, all this is part of your right to life. And so we see that there should not be any discrimination where right to life is concerned for anyone, any category of persons. We see that the Convention is especially concerned with two groups of people. One is girls/women and the other is children. Because we see when we look at the chapter on intersectionality that these two categories are most vulnerable when we look at violations of the rights of persons with disabilities. We also see that children with disabilities have to be given equal rights, should not be separated from their parents except when it is in the child's best interest, and disability should not be a cause of separating a parent and child, and this includes both the child's disability as well as parental disability. So countries should also recognize that all persons are equal before the law, prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability, guarantee equal legal protection. They have to ensure that the right to inherit an own property, to control their own financial affairs, etc. should be available to all. They should also ensure the physical and mental integrity of persons, to guarantee freedom from torture, from cruelty, inhuman or degrading treatment, and so on. Now, there is a special concern that persons with disabilities are vulnerable to abuse. So we have specifically Article 16 in the Convention, which says that there must be freedom from exploitation and possible abuse. We also see that there should not be any unnecessary, arbitrary, or illegal interference with their right to privacy, to family, to home, correspondence, to communication. And the privacy of their personal health and rehabilitation information must be protected in the same way as others. Accessibility is a very important issue if you look at Article 9, and the Convention requires us to identify and eliminate obstacles and barriers which ensure that persons with disabilities can access their environment, transportation, public facilities and services, as well as information and communications technologies. To take some examples, if you look at post roads, they don't have sidewalks that are accessible to a person in a wheelchair. A wheelchair user finds it very difficult to use the modern sidewalks. A wheelchair user would find it difficult from moving from a bus stop at a sidewalk into a bus. We also see that these barriers may not just be with regard to public spaces and transportation. It may also be there in many institutions such as educational institutions. Something as simple as having accessible classrooms may be a good thing. But it's not only the classroom that has to be accessible. If the child needs to use the restroom or the toilet, many toilets may not be accessible. And so understanding accessibility cannot be done piecemeal. One has to look at the environment as a whole. We also see that when we look at information and communications technologies, there is often the difficulty that information is not available in a format that a person with disability can easily understand. For instance, it might be written information, not spoken. So someone who cannot read cannot understand. So accessibility is a very practical issue which must be adequately addressed. We also see that persons with disabilities must be able to live independently, to be able to live in the community, to choose where, with whom to live, to have access to in-home, residential and community support services. So this is very different from rounding up every person with disability and putting them in a special home. Instead, we are saying that services must not just be available in special homes if they choose to go to the home, but those special services must be available at every individual's home or at the community level or residential level. So personal mobility and independence must also be assisted by encouraging personal mobility, training in mobility skills, devices, assistive technologies, and so on, and also, in some case, actual assistance to the person. Countries recognize the right to an adequate standard of living and social protection. So it includes public housing, service and assistance for disability-related needs, as well as assistance with disability-related expenses in cases of poverty. In India, this is a huge concern because the number of persons who are poor are very high. And when we look at poor persons with disability, we see that their problems include all the problems that poor people in general face, like problems of getting adequate food or clothing or shelter, among other basic needs. And those problems have to be addressed as well as their problems with regard to their disability, whether it's physical, intellectual, mental, etc. So poverty is a huge issue which prevents persons from being able to access their rights and which doubly disprivileges person with disability. We also find that countries must promote access to information by providing information intended for the general public in accessible formats and technologies, by facilitating the use of Braille, sign language, and other forms of communication, and by encouraging the media and internet providers to make online information available in accessible formats. While this does not happen all the time, it is at least increasing now in many ways. We see also that discrimination relating to the marriage, family and family relations must be removed. This is something we will discuss a little more in detail when we look at intersectionality and gender, because, well, face it, women are discriminated in families and women with disabilities are doubly discriminated. We also see that the states must exercise measures to ensure access to primary and secondary education, vocational training, adult education, and learning through life. So, education must employ appropriate materials, techniques, and forms of education, and no child must be left behind, including children with disabilities. So, the right to education is something that is very relevant when we look at intersectionality of childhood and disability, and that's something we will examine again a little later. So the convention also says that persons with disabilities have the right to the highest attainable standard of health without discrimination on the basis of disability, and they should have access to affordable healthcare services. This is still lacking in many countries, including in India. And we see that there should be, if you look at the last point, equal participation in political and public life, including the right to vote, to stand for elections and to hold office, which are important civil and political rights which are available to everyone, including persons with disabilities. So if you look at the second point here, we see that there must be also rehabilitation services available. Now this is a very difficult area because it's a function of so many things. One is how much states are willing to put in towards rehabilitation and the kind of rehabilitation measures that are available. Very often we find that the idea of rehabilitation is to just take a person with disability and put them in a home. And that's not what the convention really has to offer. This goes along with rehabilitation and access to different kinds of rights, including right to work and gain a living. So while we do have, as we'll see later, affirmative action or reservations in the public sector, this is not really there in the private sector, and the convention encourages that. So the convention talks about not just having the state make reservations or affirmative actions in the public sector, but to also encourage the private sector to ensure reasonable accommodation as well as opportunities for persons with disability. So non-discrimination is not just something to be done in the public sphere, but also in the private sphere. So persons with disabilities have to be included in cultural life, in recreation, in leisure and sports. And you've probably heard about the Paralympics or different kinds of sports events which are held for persons with disabilities. We also need to ensure that there must be television programs, films, theatre, cultural material in accessible formats. And if you look at the last sentence of the first point, we see that countries are to ensure their participation in mainstream and disability-specific sports. And here we see what we were talking about earlier, the multi-pronged or the two-pronged attack. You have inclusion of persons with disabilities in the mainstream, but you also have disability-specific sports. We also need to ensure proper monitoring of the convention, and the convention talks about certain measures for how it would be actually looking at periodic reports which are sent by state parties on the progress made in implementing the convention. But let's not go into this in detail. We will now move on to Unit 4, which deals with Indian standards. These look at the major legislations dealing with disability. Now, these are the important rights standards. And if you look at the reading material, you may come across some other standards. We have the Constitution of India, which we've separately dealt with in Unit 6. We have Rights of Persons with Disability Act in 2016. But if you look at a lot of materials and cases, they actually deal with the previous legislation in 1995. And many of the principles in that are still valid today. We have the Mental Health Act, again a new legislation which came out last year to replace a much older legislation. And we have the National Trust Act. So we'll be concentrating on the first three standards. We'll be looking at the Constitution of India in a separate document. We'll be looking at the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act and the Mental Health Act in detail. Now, what does the Act say? So, the present law was enacted to replace the Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act 1995. And it came into force on 30th December 2016. It has, in addition to the definitions which we saw earlier on disability, it also has definitions dealing with important concepts which are allied to this question of disability. For instance, discrimination. So in relation to discrimination, in relation to disability, what does discrimination mean? Discrimination means any distinction, exclusion, restriction on the basis of disability, which is done for the purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment or exercise of the rights of a person with disability on an equal basis with others, etc., of human rights and fundamental freedoms and so on. It includes political, economic, social, cultural, civil rights and all forms of discrimination, as well as the denial of reasonable accommodation. Here too we see a lot of similarities between the Indian law and the UN Convention. Even with regard to inclusive education, we see that there is a system of education which this Act foresees, where students with and without disabilities study together, they learn together, and the system of teaching and learning is suitably developed to meet the needs of different kinds of students with disabilities. Now, this is a model which is prevalent, but when we look at approaches later, we will see that very often the multi-pronged attack approach or the two-pronged approach is to be preferred, which has inclusive education, but may also have education which would focus on needs of students with disabilities particularly. Now, the rights and entitlements under the Indian law is very different from the list that we have looked at under the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Let us look at this now. We see that there are many rights that are listed, some which have already been mentioned in other documents like the Constitution, some which have been tackled with in other laws like family law or contract law or criminal law. So the rights and entitlements under this Act are broadly equality and non-discrimination. That means, first of all, you must have substantive or real equality. That is, that barriers must be removed to ensure that persons with disabilities are treated with equality. There must not be discrimination, which means they must not be excluded from anything simply by virtue of their disability. So equality and non-discrimination are two sides of the same coin. The second entitlement is specifically of women and children, where we say that they should enjoy the rights equally with others. Very interesting statements. Why women and children? Okay, how are women and children deeply affected when they have a disability? It talks about rights and entitlements within the community life. It talks about protection from cruelty and inhuman treatment. And this is especially so because we have seen cases which have come up in newspapers of persons with disability, for instance, being chained to beds in their hospitals, which is definitely cruel and inhuman treatment. We also find that persons with disability have often suffered abuse, violence, and exploitation by society. It happens in many ways. When we look at cases of child sexual abuse, we'll see that children with disabilities have suffered. We look at learning disabilities and we see that historically children who've had learning disabilities which went unidentified were often labeled stupid and foolish and suffered abuse, physical and mental, from their teachers and from their peers. We do have to specifically also look at protection and safety of persons with disability, as they are especially vulnerable. We also look at home and family. As I mentioned, specifically when we are looking at gender, this becomes very essential. And within the home and family, which are private spaces, we see that there is even there much discrimination against a person with disability. We look at reproductive rights of persons with disabilities. We see that very often they're denied basic reproductive rights. They denied rights of maternity. There have been cases where people with disabilities all over the world have challenged the rights of their guardians or of the state to deny them motherhood and to make decisions on their bodily autonomy, on questions of medical termination of pregnancy without their consent. In India, there have been huge controversies with regard to compulsory sterilization of women with mental disabilities by directors of homes who have the care of them, and very often within their own families. We also look at important citizenship rights. Persons with disabilities often are treated as second-class citizens, not having the same rights as other citizens. So either they are not, don't have access to go to a place to vote and to cast their vote, or they're not able to identify whom they want to cast their votes for, or someone else cast the vote on their behalf, believing them to not have sufficient legal capacity. Access to justice is a huge issue, but in India, this must be looked at also in the context of the Legal Services Act, which specifically looks at different categories of persons who are entitled to access to free legal aid. And persons with disability are entitled to free legal aid. We look at legal capacity, specifically with regard to contract law, that a person with disability, especially mental disability, often is considered to lack legal capacity to enter into a valid contract. And we look at the provision of guardianship a little later when we look at family law. The next unit we are going to look at is mental disability. Now, mental disability is sometimes an ignored area of disability law. So while you have reasonable accommodation, you have reservations for employment, very often these are used by persons with physical disability. When we look at mental disability, we see that there has been a sea change in the way that we look at mental disability, both under law of 2017 as well as in some of the additional laws that are in place. So the Mental Health Care Act was recently notified in the Official Gazette after being passed by both the Houses of Parliament. And this act tries to change the way we treat mental health and to ensure that our law is in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, there are many provisions which deal with persons with disabilities under this act. It says, first of all, that every person shall have the right to access mental health care and treatment from mental health services run or funded by the appropriate government. The right to access mental health care and treatment shall mean mental health services of affordable cost, of good quality, available in sufficient quantity, accessible geographically, without discrimination, on the basis of gender, sex, sexual orientation, religion, culture, caste, social or political beliefs, disability, or any other basis, and provided in a manner that is acceptable to persons with mental illness and their families and their caregivers. So when we look at equality and non-discrimination, what does it mean? It means that every person with mental illness shall be treated as equal to persons with physical illness in the provision of all health care. Now, why is the law making a difference between physical disability and mental disability? It's because when you look at the way that society responds to it, in terms of physical disability, at least something is done to ensure that disability barriers are removed, or the medical care model, at least a person is taken care of. But mental disability or persons with mental disability are often denied treatment. And if you look at the number of psychiatrists in India, if you look at the number of mental health services in India, they are lagging far behind as compared to even physical disability. It specifically says that there should not be discrimination on any basis, including gender, sex, sexual orientation, religion, culture, caste, social or political belief, class, or disability. Look at my mental health in some laws, just to get an example of how mental health works. Now, when we look at the Indian legal system, we see that the legal system is often constructed for an able-bodied person, or at least for a person who is of sound mental health. And these are terms which are used in different laws to deal with mental health, okay, including, as I said, sound mental health or soundness of mind. And let's take some examples to try and understand this. When we look at the Indian Contract Act, it says that contract, in order to enter into a valid contract, there have to be certain conditions met. For instance, a person has to be an adult and of sound mind. Now, these are the two essentials needed for a person to enter into a valid contract. Now, this means that a person who is not of sound mind can, of course, enter into an agreement, but that agreement will not be considered to be a binding contract. And that is really unfortunate, because when a person enters into a contract, the other person may raise the objection that it is not a valid contract, since the person did not have legal capacity, being of unsound mind. Now, the Contract Act does allow for some flexibility. It says that if a person is generally of unsound mind but has some periods of sanity, then during those periods you can enter into a valid contract. But it becomes very difficult to prove whether the contract was entered into at a time when the person understood the implications of the contract, or whether the person did not understand the implications of such contract. And when you're looking at legal incapacity, it goes to different kinds of contracts or different kinds of agreements, including, for instance, entering into an employment contract. So if you lack legal capacity, how are you going to really manage your life? So there has to be a nuanced way of approaching this in terms of being able to see how far the person can understand the consequences of their actions, or how a person can have autonomy in their lives, and how do we facilitate that instead of an completely 100% bar. Some of the terms that are used in some of the statutes are also very problematic. The terms used are things like lunacy, idiocy, lunatic, idiot, and these are terms which are considered to be extremely jarring and not correct and very insensitive. Now, of course, the justification often given for it is that these are older enactments and that they haven't changed. But it's high time we look at some of these laws and try to devise ways in which persons' capacities will be recognized more effectively. So, recognizing legal capacity of a person with disability, whether of any kind, is really the first step towards recognizing their dignity and self-worth. How the legal capacity can be exercised is a different matter altogether. Now, when we look at guardianship in laws, we see that the purpose of a guardian is to take care of someone. So a typical person who has a guardian is a child. So every child is presumed to have a legal guardian until the age of 18, which is adulthood. So until the age of 18, somebody is the guardian of the child. It might be a parent. The parent is not there. Then the court may appoint a guardian for the child. In this context, what does guardianship of a person with disabilities mean? In context of mental disabilities, person with mental disabilities not having legal capacity is often treated as someone who should be under the care of a guardian who will take decisions on behalf of this person. Now, there are two ways of looking at this guardianship. The first is plenary guardianship and the other is limited guardianship. The earlier model of disability was plenary guardianship, which meant that the guardian does all the planning for this person with mental disability. The guardian makes all the decisions on behalf of the person, and the person has no role to play in decision making. So the decisions of the guardian are presumed to be the decisions of the person with disability. Now, this model is not a very good one because it substitutes one person's judgment for the judgment of the person with disability, regardless of the extent of that disability. The model now, which has been proposed by disability rights activists and which is there in the convention, is a different model altogether. It's called limited guardianship, which means that the role of the guardian or the power of the guardian is limited. It is not complete as that of a plenary guardian. So the limited guardian only has the right to take decisions on behalf of the person, considering not just the person's best interest, but also the person's autonomy, and consulting with the person as far as possible on what decisions must be taken. To give a very clear example, to go back to the reproductive rights that we discussed earlier, in earlier situations where plenary guardians were recognized in homes, by families, by the government, the state having the care of women with disabilities, many times there used to be compulsory hysterectomy. So women's uteruses were simply removed from their bodies without taking their consent. And this was presumed to be in the best interests of women. But we understand today, when we use the language of reproductive rights, that It completely violates the reproductive rights of women with mental disability. And their consent was not taken at all. And this is something that will not be permitted when we are looking at limited guardianship. Because for taking any decision, it would look at the purpose. Why carry out a hysterectomy? What is the purpose of the hysterectomy? It serves no purpose. Okay? So a limited guardian would not be able to take such drastic steps on behalf of a woman unless the woman's consent was there. The same is true for decisions relating to childbirth, to decide whether to have a child or not, or to have a medical termination of pregnancy. These decisions would be taken by the woman as long as she could understand it, and not by plenary guardian. So limited guardianship would also try to understand whether the person wanted to enter into a contract as far as possible, and try and enable or facilitate a person's participation in decision making. So while we see that these standards, whether it is the UN Convention or it is our disability law, while the standards tend to move towards limited guardianship, on the ground the reality is still unfortunately very much that of the plenary guardian. Now let's also go on to the position of a guardian. Now a guardian of a minor only extends to the age of 18, but a guardian of a person with mental disability may extend lifetime of the person with disability. So there should be some kinds of checks and balances to make sure that the power of guardianship is not abused, that the person with disability is consulted when decisions involving him or her are being taken. Now the last point that we are looking at as examples in mental health law is personal laws. Now, in India, we have a system of personal laws where the laws relating to family matters are dealt with differently in different jurisdictions. And we see that there are many differences in the way that persons are treated based on mental disability. There are cases where mental disability becomes a ground for divorce. There are cases where a person with mental disability is not given agency in regard to marriage. There are cases where persons with mental disability are put in perpetual tutelage or perpetual guardianship of someone or the other. This is especially true with regard to women with disabilities. And this is something that we will look at in the unit dealing with intersectionality and gender. Now let's look at equality, jurisprudence and constitutional protection. Unit 6 probably deals with the philosophy behind disability rights in India and the recognition of persons with disabilities as equal citizens as everyone else. Citizenship has nothing to do with ability. It has to do with birth or naturalization. And this is something that we must keep in mind while looking at this module. Now, when we look at the Constitution of India, we see that Article 14 guarantees equality before the law and equal protection to the law to all persons. So, courts have consistently held that person should also include persons with disabilities, and courts have upheld special provisions for persons with disabilities and have been very instrumental in ensuring that rights of persons with disabilities are protected by looking at right to equality, ensuring non-discrimination, and thirdly, removing barriers. Now, we thought an interesting way of dealing with this would be to look at some of the cases that have come up as examples in different courts, particularly Supreme Court and some high courts, and to try and see how the court has examined the question of constitutional rights of this group of people. So we will be examining this through a series of cases, and for more details, of course, you can refer to your module. Now, these cases are not in chronological order. They're just to give examples of how the issues of disabilities have been dealt with by courts. Now, there was always a challenge when competitive exams were concerned, and courts have said time and again that in different competitive exams, there must be a paper which is in a format that persons with disability can be used, especially blind persons who cannot read the paper, and they should be also allowed to use a scribe. We see that even in certain kinds of employments like PE teachers or PT teachers, they have very clearly said that as long as there is a qualification, educational qualifications, as well as sufficient training, a person with disability cannot be denied employment on the same basis. Now, Javed Abidi's case was an interesting one. This dealt with difficulty in Indian Airlines, where a person had difficulty in accessing the airlines, and so the directions were given by the Supreme Court to the Indian Airlines, and of course subsequently this is being followed in other airlines as well, to ensure that there will not be any inconvenience faced by a person with locomotor disability who is not able to move freely. But we see that even now when you look at many kinds of public transport, including buses and trains, there are still challenges to accessing means of transport. Sometimes states have been required by the Supreme Court to give constant reports of their compliances with the laws relating to disabilities, to show what steps they have taken and how promptly they have worked in order to satisfy the rights of persons with disabilities. We also see that there have been sometimes cases where though we have good laws and on paper everything seems to be fine. As we've seen, when we went through the laws, there seem to be so many different criteria. There seem to be so many different rights which are available under laws. But when you actually look at ground realities, how many of these laws are actually being used? How many persons with disabilities are actually getting employment? Are spaces actually accessible to persons with disabilities? Now, these are uncomfortable questions and the answers are not too good. So many places are still not accessible. So we see that sometimes, as in the previous case that was previous slide, we see that there have been cases filed by NGOs working on rights of persons with disabilities to the court, requesting the court to follow up and to make sure that the schemes, the laws that are in place for persons with disabilities are actually being implemented. So having the law is one thing, implementing the law is another. So we see that there have been a series of public interest litigations just focusing on the implementation of the law. This is one of them, which was concerned with non-implementation of the 3%, the earlier 3% reservation of seats in educational institutions, access to persons to move about and access facilities adequately in educational institutions, teaching methodology and tools in order to ensure effective learning. So when we look at the Constitution of India and we look at Article 14 as we did earlier, it has several prohibited markers, like you cannot discriminate against a person based on caste or sex, etc. Now, disability is not one of those named criteria for lack of discrimination. And the question is, when you look at intersexual discrimination, you have several cases where there might be discrimination on different grounds, but it can't be only on one ground. So the question often being raised is that disability does not really form separate ground, or rather one of the grounds under which discrimination is not permitted. But that of course doesn't mean that a person with disability can be discriminated against. And time and again they have said, the court has said that ensuring affirmative action for other groups of people is also to be carried out to persons with disabilities, and affirmative action for them has often been upheld. Now sometimes there are cases where a person moves from a category of an able-bodied person to a person with disability. So not all disability is by birth. And in some cases, there have been situations where a person has become disabled because of an accident or an illness or something else. And very often the question has been raised on whether the person can continue with their employment. And often the courts have said that their employment must not be terminated on the basis of disability, but they should be probably put into task or given duties which they will be able to perform. So although it was not seen as a constitutional right, very often it has been seen on humanitarian grounds that because of a disability, a person's employment must not be terminated. Take one quote from a case: "The workmen are not denizens of an animal farm to be eliminated ruthlessly the moment they become useless to the establishment. They have not only to live for the rest of their lives, but also maintain members of their family and their dependents, and to educate and bring up their children." Now, there have been some cases where different kinds of disability have been raised, like color blindness, for instance, which really does not specifically fall within the purview of the Act. Now, how should the law treat persons with disability? Should they be equally treated? Should it be similar persons treated similarly, and so on? So the Supreme Court has said that equal protection of the law does not mean that every law must have universal application throughout the country. It implies equality of treatment to persons who are similarly situated, and that like should be treated as like without any discrimination. We also see that as far as courts are concerned, even though disability is not one of the named markers of prohibition of discrimination under the Fundamental Rights chapter, generally courts have looked at treatment of persons with disability very, very carefully, and it has upheld or not been afraid really to call out discrimination where there has been discrimination against persons with disability. Now, in the next two units, we are going to be looking at the issue of intersectionality. So what does intersectionality mean? Intersectionality means that while we do understand that persons with disabilities need their rights protected, when disability intersects with other criteria of vulnerability, especially gender or childhood, the vulnerability of such an individual is much higher, and this definitely needs to be addressed. So let us look at the intersectionality of disability and gender. Let us specifically look at women with disability. Now, women with disability can be protected by the Constitution under the articles which deal with affirmative action for women. So all women can be protected, women with disabilities can also be protected. However, we also see that under the legislative framework that we do have, you can have special provisions for persons with disabilities who are women. So women with disabilities can be a separate subcategory which can be, where affirmative action can be carried out. Now, while we understand the fact that women with disability have specific difficulties that they face from their birth to their life chances, to education, to employment, and so on, constitutionally their rights are protected. Affirmative action is possible. However, women with disabilities are doubly disadvantaged when it comes to the home, to the private sphere, to the family. As we've seen earlier, the problem of plenary guardian means that women find themselves under perpetual guardians within their own families. And we find that within this private sphere of families, women are extremely discriminated against, especially women with disabilities. So while we can go on and on to look at different areas where women with disabilities are discriminated against, I thought we would focus on just three areas, okay, just to get an idea of how this works. Let's look at marriage. Usually, women are often forced into stereotyped roles. I'm not talking about women with disability, but women in general are forced into stereotyped roles of marriage and motherhood. So, women with disability are denied even these roles. Very often we find that women with disabilities do not marry. That has changed now because of the sex ratio of women. So we find actually cases where women with disabilities have been, given to men living far away, sometimes trafficked to persons who want a wife because there are no wives available. Now, when we look at marriage, when it's a person with disability, whether a man or a woman, is a marriage valid if it is with a person with mental disability? Now, the law says that most personal laws do say that a marriage with a person with a mental disability may, in some cases, be avoidable marriage, or to put it in the language that the law uses, insanity can be either a ground for the invalidation of a marriage, or it can be a ground, as we will see in the last point, for divorce. Now, when we look at the validity of a marriage, a person with a disability may enter into a marriage. However, the other spouse can also always say that they did not have legal capacity to marry and end the marriage. That is the first way. The second is that very often these people in a marriage are often under the care of a guardian. So we see that very often women are given into marriages by their guardians who decide who the best spouse for them should be. And after the marriage, the husband acts as the guardian for this woman with mental disability. We see that in motherhood also there is a lot of discrimination against women. We see that women with disability have been specifically targeted for operations such as hysterectomies, where their hysterectomies are carried out without their permission or without their consent. Now let us look at this very interesting case of Robert Highcamp. What happened in this case was that there was a woman with mental disability who was found on the streets and rescued by an organization, and she was pregnant at that time and she gave birth to a child. So the child was brought before the juvenile justice authorities, and they decided that the mother was an unfit guardian and decided to declare the child fit for adoption and place the child in adoption with foreign couple. However, the mother, through another organization, challenged this. And finally, they said that, well, the determination of the mother's ability to take care of the child, or rather, the determination of her unfitness, was not done properly. Because under the earlier law, it had to be done with a panel of doctors who evaluate her, and it can't be done by any authority simply like that. The correct procedure has to be followed in order to declare her to be unfit, and that should be done very, very carefully. So she was actually able to challenge this and get her child back. So very often, because of actions like compulsory hysterectomy or compulsory sterilizations, or even sometimes being forced to carry out medical terminations of pregnancies, motherhood is not often allowed to a woman with severe mental disability. The last is divorce. Insanity is a ground for divorce under many personal laws. And of course, it's available to both the wife and the husband. So the wife can claim the ground, the husband can claim the ground. But when we look at the way that insanity is used as a ground for divorce, we see that it's usually used by the husband to divorce the wife. And it can be anything. They get, statements from doctors claiming to be experts. And there was an expose carried out by a newspaper some years back where they showed how husbands, by giving money, were able to show that their wives were of unsound mind and get a divorce. Now, there's unfortunately the smear factor when it comes to disability. So if a woman has not behaved rationally or what is considered rationally by society in one aspect, that starts coloring everything else she does. And then it affects her chances at being able to give, a proper response. And when we look at insanity as a ground for divorce, it's actually a very high burden. It's not there's a difference between the medical insanity and the legal insanity. You can't simply show medical insanity. You have to actually prove that the person is not capable of being in a valid marriage. Now, there's this interesting case of divorce called Raju's Career, where the wife's mother, who was the guardian of the woman, had got the woman married, and later the husband wanted to divorce the woman on the ground of mental disability. And the woman's mother, the wife's mother, gave a statement saying, yes, she has mental disability, and a divorce was granted. But the woman went on appeal, and the appellate court said the mother had no right to do that. It's not for the mother to make a statement saying, yes, my daughter has mental disability and therefore should not be married. It is for the mother as the guardian to actually, on behalf of the daughter, claim that there is no mental disability, or if there is mental disability, that it's not such disability as would affect the marriage. So the mother acted as plenary guardian when she should actually have acted as a limited guardian. Now, by and large, the courts have held that even without important articles which allow for affirmative action is always good where it is geared to the larger goal of protecting rights of persons with disability. And there are other cases, though, which have not really been specifically on disability, which have recognized the right to life of all individuals in many ways. Now, let's look at the last unit, which is children with disability. We will be focusing on the right to education as well as some other key areas. Now, many decisions have slowly built up the right to education of every child. We've seen cases which have talked about the right to life being broad enough to bring in the sky, and which talk about the rights of children to be able to develop in a holistic manner. And we see that when we look at education institutions, there are cases which have dealt with everything, including inclusive education to the reservation of seats for persons with disability. We have seen specific cases where children with disabilities have been denied admission in education institutions and which have approached court. And where courts have made statements, it's a legal duty of the government to provide free educational services till the age of 18 years. Now, the protection of children has been more than just looking at the right to education. Of course, the right to education has always been a controversial right. And it's well recognized now that as far as possible there must be inclusive education, that there must be integrated teaching of all children within educational spaces. But it's also recognized that sometimes you might need to give special attention to certain categories of children. Now there have been cases, the other set of cases where one should look at child rights deeply is the cases of child abuse, because a child with disability has high potential for abuse. And there have been cases where girls with mental disability have been raped, and very clearly the courts have said that there's a difference between submission and consent, and trying to understand whether a person with disability has given consent is something that must be done very, very carefully. We also see that understanding a child witness statement and seeing if the child has sufficient understanding and is qualified to be a witness has to be done specifically with regard to each child. So just as each child is valued, so too should a child with disability be valued, to see whether the person understands what has happened and is qualified to be a witness. So when we look at intersectionality, we see it's really important. There are areas of intersectionality like poverty, which make any talk on disability so difficult because poverty is itself a huge issue. And in studies, dealing with poverty and disability, very often the response of women have been that, first of all, we don't have the basic necessities of life. So how are you going to be addressing issues of disability? In countries like India, there are many challenges confronting access to equal rights of persons with disabilities. But let us not forget that persons with disabilities are equal citizens of our country and they're equal world citizens. The standards both in the international conventions as well as in domestic laws is to protect rights of persons with disabilities under the Constitution and in individual laws to the full possible extent. And that is what we must endeavor to do as students of human rights. Thank you.